Hey there, my name is Randy Castle, and this is a Shared Inheritance Roundtables talks for the month of May. This month, we've been talking about putting on the readiness of the gospel of peace. Um, and so we're just going to get right to it. I'm here with the other four editors, and we'll be discussing that today. So I'd like to start by reading from Romans 8, 1 through 6. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their mind on things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things of the Spirit. For to set your mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. In Ephesians 6:15, while putting on the armor of God, Christians are told, as shoes for your feet, put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In the passage we just read, we clearly see our peace, along with life, comes from this gospel or good news. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set us free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. And for Christians, we understand this, don't we? We understand that we have been freed from our sins through Christ's sacrifice and service. But notice, we are to put on not only the gospel of peace, but the readiness of the gospel of peace. One of the most powerful images we are given in the Bible is that of the Israelites in the wilderness as a type, or Paul calls it in 1 Corinthians 10, an example of Christians living here in the flesh, waiting to enter our promised land, heaven. I use this comparison in my article, and I certainly don't want to beat a dead horse, but I would like to once again use a passage from Deuteronomy today to guide our discussion when looking at the different facets and effects of this peace on us and through us as we interact with others also. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 that with most of them, meaning the Israelites, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Paul continues to explain that God weeded out those who desired evil, practicing idolatry, sexual immorality, putting Christ to the test, and grumbling. But in Deuteronomy 4, Moses stands before those who have survived and who are preparing to finally enter the promised land. In Deuteronomy 4:10, but you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. See, I have taught you the statutes and the rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who, when they hear of these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that the statutes and the rules so righteous as all the law that's set before you today? Only take care and keep your soul diligent, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. Today, we are going to discuss how to keep our souls diligent or ready and keep this peace given to us with this good news and how to keep it in our heart always. We're going to talk about the effect of this peace that it has on ourselves and within our families, within congregations, and then finally, peace that we can have in the world. We're going to start with Jill. Jill is going to address the peace that we have within. So Jill, how can we keep our souls diligent, not forgetting the good news? How can we find peace within? How can we combat anxiety, unrest, worry, hatred, jealousy, discontentment, etc., and find inner peace as Christians? And I thought maybe you could also expand on Philippians 4:4-7. It's a pretty loaded question.
I was just say, I'm glad I don't have to know the answer, that God gave us the answer because I don't know. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read that verse, Philippians 4:4-7, just because I address it then later. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. All right, so I was laughing with the ladies beforehand that she gave me this question because I am the one out of all of us that really deals with anxiety and panic attacks and depression and all other sorts mental health issues. And I want to give a caveat before I give this answer that I am not talking about brain chemistry issues. That is different. If that is something that's going on, I feel like you can't. Anyways, that is something that also needs to be addressed. But like I said, this is a hard one. This is something I wrestle with all the time, except, I mean, on all of those, except, I don't know, maybe hatred. But anyways, but this was a good time for me to reflect particularly on this aspect of the armor, as I currently am dealing with a lot of anxiety and worry, as we just found out that my mom needs a liver transplant and just everything in the unknown of that. And so to add that to my anxiety that I always have about my business and making sure that I can take care of all of my team and our clients, it's been a lot. But I think that's the point of this verse and this whole concept. What happens when I start to think that I have to control everything, that I have to be the one that fixes everything. And that when I think that I even can control everything, which again, as an oldest child and a type A sort of bossy woman, I always, that's when I always start to struggle with this concept of, it's when I think I'm in control. And if we think like that, no wonder we're dealing with anxiety and worry, because I am very bad at being the one in charge. But thankfully we're not. So that verse in Philippians, I turn to quite often when I need to help reframe my mindset. Because thankfully we're given an outline of what to do to find this inner peace as a Christian in the midst of so much turmoil in our lives and in the world. We give it to God. We pray to him about it. We give thanks to him while we let our request be known, which I love that verse too, when it's telling you how to let your request be known to God, and that it's okay to let your request be known to God, and that he wants it. And that we talk to him about it. And then the more that we do that, the more that we start to cultivate this inner peace, realizing that it's actually better that I'm not the one that's in control. I don't have to be the one in charge. He is much better at that than I am. It's that knowledge that provides us with that peace that it talks about in those verses that we cannot even fully understand, that guards our hearts and our minds and our thoughts. That's what I typically struggle with. What's going on in my head and my thoughts as we walk through this life. I love so much how when the armor of God is talked about in Ephesians, that Randy talked about in her article as well, that this particular piece of the armor is compared to as shoes for your feet, put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Shoes are the last thing most of us put on before we leave the house, before we leave the comfort and the safety of our homes to go out into the world. It's what protects our feet in order for us to keep going, to keep walking, to keep serving, to keep moving forward. And that's what God's inner peace, I feel, does for us. Helps us keep walking. So anyways, that's my 2 cents on the subject.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if we don't have the inner peace, then we're not going to be able to act peaceably and act as peaceably people, of course.
Yeah. Well, I personally then won't put on my shoes and won't go outside. So it's like, so yes, it is something I need. So.
Well, thanks, Jill.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on then, as we've figured out how to do self peace, we'll move on to within our family. Um, Liz, it seems true kind of across many cultures that women set the tone and mood of the home. How can women promote peace within a family? At the end of the passage in Deuteronomy, Moses exhorts the people to pass what they know and have known to their children and their children's children. So, how can we continue to promote peace even in families as they grow and change? And I asked you because you're the only grandmother here, but specifically in Titus 2, it tells the older women to teach the younger women. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. I will say this, because I know that we have all different folks listening and ladies who listen. And so I think the mood of a home can be, is primarily set by the heart of the woman. And I don't, obviously there are homes that don't have children in them, and there are homes that don't always have husbands in them. And so I think that the discussion is valuable no matter who it is that we're influencing. But certainly mothers have a particular advantage and challenge as they have children and young children who are formulating the ideas that will, dominate their hearts in the early years of their life. And so as I talk, I don't want to disclude someone who may not have children, who has influence upon other family members, both parental and their husbands. Certainly their heart has to rest sure and steadfast with their wives. But I've said for many years that I think it's an interesting discussion among the saints of our Savior, that there would be any disadvantages to being a second generation Christian. I started hearing that conversation after I'd lived overseas for 16 years and I came back to America. And there was this idea that somehow those who were converted late in life had a certain advantage and understanding of the scriptures, that those who had been born and raised in homes where they attended services on a regular basis, worship services on a regular basis, somehow were disadvantaged. And that those raised by parents who themselves had been baptized into the newness of life can't understand with the same passion and zeal that their own parents had understood, or that others who come to this after a life outside of the knowledge of Christ can possess. And somehow that specialness or that peculiarity, that purity, the peace, the joy, the understanding of being a child of God for the next and second generation just somehow was hard to possess in the same way. And of course, I understand what's meant by the conversation, that we as Christian mothers need to understand that there are generational dangers, that we need to be very aware and cognizant of the principles, the fundamental principles of the gospel that we teach, both in our words, but more especially perhaps in our actions, in our responses. That true joy, that true peace, that true love, the core of the gospel message that's demonstrated, should give children a great advantage, actually, an understanding of what it means to live for Christ and what walking in the light actually looks like. So therefore, there should certainly be advantages. And of course, if we don't believe this, then we really make a mockery, don't we, of what Randy read in the book of Deuteronomy, that a book that God instructs his special chosen nation, his special people, Israel, to make their children strong in him, that he would instruct something that would not be possible. It seems outrageous to me. So, of course, the true answer to this observation by many who look at homes that produce children who don't have the understanding of these things is that the true principles are not seen and taught within our homes, even the homes of our saints, that there's anxiety and there's worldly ambition and there's wisdoms of the earth living within the homes of the saints. And that's really the true discussion, isn't it? The true discussion is, what do our homes look like? In order to do what God had asked the children of Israel to do, the words of his message, the instruction, the understanding of what we should be written on our doorpost. It should be always in the forefront of our mind. It should always be within our in the front of our eyes. And that's hard to do when you get in the fray of living a life that is busy and that has the world coming in at you from different places. And of course, among the many characteristics that are learned behaviors, actually, peace may be one of the most apparent by observation. A true peace, obviously not the volume of conversation or laughter in a home. There are a lot of loud, boisterous families that are joyful and at peace. And so we don't want to endanger large families, for being loud. But it is an inner calm, obviously, that comes from the understanding and priorities that are established. It's the lack of drama that's produced by a world that causes this unsettled tossing to and fro to meet the expectations of worldly wisdoms. The peace of God that dwells in the hearts that's described in Colossians, the 3rd chapter. James has one of the prettiest passages, I think, that tells us of peace. He gives us great insight into what the difference of living with peace versus living in turmoil looks like. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." It's not the wisdoms of this world which sow discord and strife, he says. He says, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. That is not wisdom. This wisdom, he says, does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing is there. It's unrest, and there is no peace in that self-seeking. I did it years ago, spoke in Texas at that conference that they have out there. And we talked about, running that race that's set before us with that cloud of witnesses, as Hebrews, the 12th chapter, just so beautifully describes. And I had the last lesson that week. And by the end of that time, there were some wonderful lessons about running the race and what it means to run a marathon and to take off those weights. But as I sat there that weekend, I came to the conclusion that I'm not sure it's not that we don't know how to run. We run like crazy. We run like crazy all the time. We're just running in arenas that have no wisdom and no true value to the goal that is set before us. James says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure and then peaceable and gentle. It's willing to yield. It's full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And it is something that we establish within ourselves first. There's no question that the mood and the direction of a home, any home, whether there be a husband, whether there be just a husband, whether there be and a wife, or whether there be children and grandchildren, is produced and determined by and large by the mother. And a peaceful home begins with a righteous woman. And so it's someone who understands who they are, that understands what is right and what is wrong, like we talked about last week, relies on the righteousness of God, lives her life with confidence, that can tread those battlefields with feet that are shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. It eliminates the drama. The peace that comes when the heart of a mother is securely resting, not on the superficial righteousness that she somehow has determined and her children can see straight through, but the righteousness of God, which determines what is really truly right and wrong in life's homes. And our world today are restless, and they are disrupted, and they are interfered with many days because the mother or the wife does not know who she is. And she's not that first generation soldier that she needs to be. And there's a lack of understanding, and there's a weakness of faith. And there's a mother who seeks the wisdoms of the world, watching and listening to what others, she's talking to her friend who's, 27 years old. to tell her the wisdoms that she's read on the internet or on something, watching and listening for others who are misdirected to inform and guide the ideas of her home. And just allowing the world to seep in through the walls of social media and television and school and playgrounds. You know, I've known women that listen to their own children who have heard something at school, not guarding or protecting, and therefore, before realizing it, there is that danger. That city is in unrest and disrepair, and there is no hope for peace that is supplied by God in the gospel message. I have to tell you, at the end of my little session, I want to tell you that I look at 2 passages in Psalms for the definition of a godly home. And I love these 2 Psalms, and I use these 2 Psalms in a lot of my classes, and I read them for my own sake. They rest together in the scriptures, 127 and 128. They are both lovely passages about the women, the mothers, the wives within a home, and a conversation of what a peaceful home looks like. Psalms 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. You know, we've got mothers that are running around all over town trying to build this home that looks right and sounds right, and everybody can see that it's perfect. But unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early and to sit up late and to eat the bread of sorrows. You know, you're working, you're staying up late, you're sleeping restless hours, and you're fighting for everything that the world has told you, and you're eating the bread of sorrows. You know, it says later that the watchman, you know, sits on the wall. For behold, the children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like the arrows at the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. The watchman stays awake in vain. He's sitting, he's looking out in the city, he's watching everything around him without a consideration of God, 127 tells us, the Psalm tells us. And his watching's in vain, because he's looking out at the world, and a fire starts in the city behind him and burns the city down. And there are mothers who don't understand what's happening within their own homes. They've got all the boxes checked. They've taken those children dressed to the hilt to every single service, to every worship service. They've gotten them there. They've set them in those pews. They've made great grades. They've done all their chores. Their talents are seen by everybody. The expectations of the world are met, and the house is on fire. And the walls of the home don't protect a child where there is no peace within. There's no rest. The children have no direction at all. The children are running around like crazy. In 128, it says, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your home. Your children will be olive plants all around the table. Behold, thus the man is blessed who fears the Lord. The wife, the mother, the woman of the home here is described as that vine that grows up on the walls within the home from the heart of the home. And she clings to the foundations and the walls of that home. One commentator in this verse says that she is the strength that keeps the walls from falling down around her family as they eat at the table, the blessed returns of the labor of the hands of the man. Her vine secures and protects from the battles of the world, bearing the fruit of righteousness, providing peace so that her husband and her children and all of those who enter her home and have her home as part of their life eat and grow themselves happy and bearing their own fruits all around the table in a city that is safe and secure, where there is happiness, peace, and blessings. And I really think that's it. I think that that's what we do, whether we have husbands or whether we have husbands and children, whether we have grandchildren. It is a woman who knows who she is within her heart, that then through her own home provides those blessings of peace to whoever it is that is able to be around her.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. My children appreciate you as your grandchildren. And I think we just like you said, I mean, peace is one of those things that people see. That's in Deuteronomy. That's what he's talking about. All right, Aunt Lee, you're going to be addressing the local church and how we find peace within the local church. So how can peace that's within promote the unity within a congregation? How can women who have a more submissive and quieter role promote peace and unity when our voices can sometimes go unheard and underrepresented, especially those of us who don't have believing husbands who can represent us and that sort of thing. Ephesians 4 is the passage that I asked you to address, and I can read it if you want, or were you going to read it?
I was.
Okay, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah. Well, because I thought I'm gonna address it and pull a piece out of it and then look at that. So Ephesians 4:1-6 says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And I started out with the idea, like Elizabeth was saying, it's about having the peace in our individual hearts first. And so the question, how can peace promote unity within a congregation? And I think, in some ways, how could it not promote peace within or unity within a congregation? How could peace not promote that? But if we understand that being at peace with God comes from realizing what he's done for us and taking up the battle then against Satan. So if we're at war with Satan, then we're at peace with God. And if we're at peace with Satan, then we're at war with God. There's not any middle ground. But in a congregation of God's people, what we should have is all those people who have that individual foundation under them. And I think about, you think about the sketches, I guess, not really pictures of the Roman soldiers in battle with their backs to each other, encircled, and their shields outward. I think that's the picture then in my brain of the local congregation, that my foundation in peace individually provides part of that larger than foundation at the local work, where together we're going to stand our ground and collectively keep our footing in a peaceable relationship with God. And in order to be at peace with God, then we have to be at peace with each other as well. It's not a concept, again, that's foreign. Like Elizabeth was saying, running the race, we understand we run all the time, and we understand that fighting in unison makes us stronger a front. In the military, it's the band of brothers idea. It's not that it's not just encouraged to be in unison and to have one's welfare be as important as the next person's welfare, but it is cultivated in the individuals that make up the whole. And our local congregations then need to be those military units, just to carry on the military metaphor. And so the verses that you provided in the question, Paul urges Christians to bear with one another in love, which is the way that we maintain unity and the bond of peace. It's our peace with God binds us together, and peace with each other, and our love for one another is what sets us apart from the world, which is a self-centered place with messages of self-love. We talked about that in our February roundtable. Randy, I think you were the one who brought up that idea that we get these messages of self-care from the world, but the message of Christ is love for each other. And so I went to John 13, in verses 34 and 35, where he tells his disciples, he's going to give them a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciple, if you have love for one another. This message to his disciples is in the upper room. He's leaving. And to some extent, before his death, it's really Christ that keeps them together. But what happens when he's gone and they can't follow? It's going to be their love for each other then that will keep them from disintegrating and fragmenting once he's gone. And they're going to provide solace for each other, he says, and they're going to become the substitute of his own presence with each other. And I think that we do the same. We might be poor substitutes for the presence of Christ, but we know that where two or more of us are gathered in his name, that he's there. And so in loving each other, we show our love for Christ. And it's going to set us apart from the world. It's how the world is going to know us. And so I think about those things in connection with the local work and particularly a woman's role in it. I've had the experience for the past 20 years of working with Christians who on the surface have very little in common with me. Culturally, we are from different worlds. Our life experiences have been vastly different. And what I have learned and seen in action is that absolutely none of that matters. We have to throw culture out the window. We have to get to know each other, and we have to serve each other, and we have to submit to each other. We have to think the best of each other, which is how love is defined in 1 Corinthians 13. And so this new commandment, which really was only an extension of an old commandment, it's just going to look totally different now. It takes away all those earthly bindings of culture and family ties and social standing. We're stripped of all of those things, and we're told to love. And it's going to be a new measure of love. I heard somebody say in a ladies' class one time that we have to love each other, but we don't have to like each other. That we have to, and it's such a strange and unwise interpretation of God's laws of love. I don't know how you find something to love about somebody that you can't find something to like about. If we think about the congregation in Philippi, we know, we can assume, I don't guess we know, but we can assume that the Philippian jailer is there, and we can assume that Lydia is there. I like to think that the slave girl that Paul cast the evil spirits out of is there. Why wouldn't she be, is my thought. But you think about Philippi, it's a town that sits where Europe and Asia meet. It was a commercial hub of people coming and going. So it's going to have a diverse group of people, mostly Gentiles. Undoubtedly, they have a lot of earthly philosophies to battle. But the letter to the church there, Paul commends them for their love for him and for each other. He tells them what a joy they are, and not only for himself, but to God. And then he tells them that they have lightened his load by sharing his affliction. And I do think it's worth noting that since we're talking about women and serving in the local congregations, the only admonishment in the letter to the church of Philippi is to Euodia and Syntyche, two women who have a disagreement with each other. And maybe it's doctrinal. They don't seem to be silly, shallow women. They are characterized, and he calls them fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. But I think it's important to know that even though sometimes we may feel underrepresented and unheard, that our voices can either lend to that undercurrent of peace and unity, or they can lend themselves to divisiveness. I mean, this was obviously causing a problem. Paul doesn't address the issue because the issue is not the point. He reminds them that they have to be of one mind, and he calls the other members of the congregation to help them. And so maybe sometimes we're the people who need help, and maybe sometimes we're the people who lend help and perspective, but these women are going to have to put aside whatever their difference was, because their names are in the book of life. We have to remember that, which is how we have that peace and joy, which Jillian referred to, and talking about that, you know, that we guard our minds. And then we have the peace that surpasses understanding. It is, our voices are either part of the peace or they're not. And the love that we have in a local congregation can't be some sentiment. It's not something that we necessarily just comes naturally, that we feel an affinity for somebody. It's action. It's not something that comes from family ties or common interest or obligation. This love is going to expand us and challenge us in ways that in my life I could never have predicted. And it will make us choose. We will choose to serve and choose to bear the burdens of others. It's going to broaden our scope of understanding of the kingdom, of the sacrifice that Christ offered for us. And it should compel us to teach and to pour out our resources and our energy for the good of the kingdom. It's not like we haven't been given an example to follow. I mean, Jesus says, you love one another as I have loved you. His is the perfect example of love. It's not tarnished or dimmed by time or by culture or by circumstance. And so that oneness and unity that we have with each other is born out of love, and it has to be a love like Christ has. You know, as a woman, I have served without a husband, and I'll admit that I have felt unheard at times, but I'm not sure that has as much to do with the congregation or the men as it does with my personality, and the fact that I think women, generally speaking, like to think that we know the way things should be done. We have very certain ideas. I may or may not know what I think should happen. I can neither confirm nor deny that I might be a little bossy. And Jillian and Elizabeth both touched on that. But I also think that there are women in congregations who want to know things, but they don't want to help. They don't want to do anything. They just like knowing. And that is a problem. And that's not love. And that doesn't promote unity. It's unproductive. And I think more times than not, it actually makes things worse. It causes division. It causes problems for people who are trying to get their lives in order and their lives straight. It does not help to have women talking about it and gossiping and criticizing and stepping in and saying, let me tell you what you need to do. That's just not, those are not ways that we serve. You know, and it's like Elizabeth was talking about, there's this pretense of service, but there's no real peace. That's not peace. And at the end of the day, whether, I would assume everybody here is listening as a woman, but women or men, our service, our calling is the same. It's our service looks different, but in a way, we all serve in the way that we've been called, and bringing my heart and mind into the submission with the will of God puts me at peace with God. And then ultimately it should put me at peace with my fellow laborers. And I have to remind myself sometimes that I can't let my pride get in the way. It isn't about me feeling heard. I serve in the ways that I'm needed, and I try to find ways that I think will be encouraging or purposeful to others. We have the only message of peace and hope that exists, and we have to protect it. We protect it with truth. You know, this is not peace for the sake of peace. This is not some submissive peace where we just don't ever stand firm and defend the truth. We defend the truth, but it is peace with God. And I think then that manifests itself in love. And it's love for his word, love for his law, his wisdom, and ultimately for his children. And so we just get to work.
Yeah, and I think it really does like you were saying, I think it always boils down to having your mind on this, the spirit. If you're not thinking about yourself, if you don't have your mind on the flesh, if you're not thinking about, like you were saying, running the race and just going through the motions and making it about yourself, then it really is, we are promised peace. And if we set our mind on the spirit, we will for sure find it. And it's something that the world is looking for. And they can't, there's nothing that this world offers for peace, which is a great segue into Amy's question. So peace within the world. What is a Christian's responsibility for promoting peace within a society or political culture? Can you expand on the passage that we read in Deuteronomy when it talks about people seeing peace in the people? I guess I can read it. Let's see. For that will be your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the people who, when they hear all these things, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So in the time of political unrest and war, and when politicians are starting to make laws that could go against or even threaten a Christian way of life, how do we find and promote peace, and what is our responsibility within a society and a culture?
So, as we're recording this, there is a war going on in Europe between the Ukraine and Russia. At least in the United States, we've just experienced another large scale school shooting that's killed 21 people. And it's nothing new, unfortunately, this year. These continue to happen. So I'm saying that to just say, as in all times of the world is not at peace. We are experiencing unrest. And I would say, at least in America, for American women, we're probably experiencing an uptick of unrest in the last 2 years, at least, unlike we've seen in our lifetimes. So we've been blessed, but that doesn't, there's no promises of that sticking around. And so when I was dwelling on this topic, I think what's hard for me is, once again, I want to reiterate what the other women have said. This is the peace with God, us with God, the gospel of peace, because I had to go back and even remind myself of what Jesus said in Matthew 10:34, that I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. And how do we reconcile that then with what Paul says when he says in 12, at the end of 12 and 18, he says, as if as possible, so far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. So what does that mean? Like, how do we pull those two things together? Well, I think even Paul would tell you, if you go look, he had some lack of peace with people. He was stoned by people. He even confronted some, right, to give his point of view. I think the difference is Paul recognized, I'm not going to be unnecessarily eager to fight, unnecessarily eager to throw into the chaos of the world. But if I have to stand for the truth, that's where we'll draw the line, right? So there's going to be a line in the sand with the world when you're saying something that does not agree with the gospel of peace, right? And that's when we have to take our stand. However, I think sometimes Christians, and I will say, at least in our culture, we have gotten a reputation for, we're ready to pick a fight, right? Sometimes it's like we want to take a political stance, and we're going to conflate that with the gospel, right? And we're going to dig our heels in, and we're not going to try to look and see that the other people on the other side of the aisle, whatever aisle you may choose, they are people too. And living in peace means trying to see the best in others, right? I mean, I have talked to Christians who they don't even know these people that they're talking about, but they're making assumptions about who they are and what they're like and what their motivations are. That's not fair. That's, they don't know that any better than that other person knows your motivations and what you're like and what you believe. And let's be honest with ourselves. We have Christians on both sides of the aisle, whatever they may be. We have Christians across all kinds of spectrums of thought about how the world should be run, kind of like what Lee was getting to. So if we are ready to dig our heels in over some of these things that are not matters of salvation, we're not living at peace with the world, right? We're not providing a peaceable viewpoint. And in my opinion, we've almost undermined ourselves that now when we're getting into an area where we really may have battles that mean something as far as certain laws being put into place, we've already undermined ourselves by wanting to pick battles over things that didn't matter. And so I think we should be very careful and tread carefully in that world, because at the end of the day, politics is not going to dictate my salvation. It's just not. The part of the world that I live in is not going to dictate my salvation. And so what you have to say is, I'm not saying it's wrong to get involved in those things. I don't believe that. But if you do get involved in them, please be careful and recognize that you are shedding an example and a light, right, for Christ. You are his representative here. And think thoughtfully, right? I think one thing I view Christ, even though he said those words, I look at how he interacted with so many people, and it was peaceably, right? I mean, I even watch how he responded while he was being wrongfully arrested and taken to trial. And I think it's why Pilate was so amazed. Like, why aren't you saying something? What is wrong with you? Speak up for yourself. And Jesus didn't do that. He actually peaceably went to the cross for us. That's what he did. And when he said he came to bring a sword, what he was saying is there's a dividing line between the world, what's worldly and what's spiritual. And I've come to put that in the clear light of day. And ladies, whether you like it or not, if you're dealing directly with someone that is very tied to the world, this gospel that brings you peace actually brings them, it's like a thorn in the flesh. It is an irritant, and it's going to make them annoyed and upset. And so you're naturally probably going to chafe sometimes, because that doesn't bring them peace. But it doesn't mean that we're to be cruel and mean and hateful and spiteful. So I think that is how I view this. And there's wiser women on this call even that can probably step in and correct me, but that's how I view peace at the world. It's that even though all these things I just mentioned are going on, I can still rest in the assurance and peace of my Lord. No matter if there's wars, if there are shootings, if there are any of those things, I have to put my assurance in God. And that's where I'm putting it. And I'm going to be as much of a peacemaker as I can, even with the people that are causing strife and turmoil. But I'm also expected to hold firm. And that's where I have to draw that line. And if it causes chafe, it causes chafe. But I shouldn't ever just be itching to go fight with somebody, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't read the verse. So the verse that Amy was referencing was Romans 12:14-18. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise beyond your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So absolutely. And again, it all boils down to if we find this peace within, if we understand who we are, if we're focused on the spiritual, if we understand that this is the wilderness that we're wandering in and that we have something better, then all of these happening, it's easy to say for sure, but harder to do. But it's that inner peace that has to come first, then that is seen within the world. Are there any other comments? I appreciate everything. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to read. There are 3 articles about being ready in the Gospel of Peace, and many more in the Trenches articles that are more topical and sort of random. So thank you so much for your time.